Welcome back. Welcome back to our series in Anatomy and Physiology, Biology 1120, Vancouver Community College. So a friend of mine actually looked at my lectures. I was like, oh my goodness. And he said, oh, you say welcome back every time. So now I'm going to have to say welcome back every time. So this lecture today is about the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and somatic reflexes. Well, we'll start with the spinal cord. Today, here is spinal cord word scramble. So what I need you to do is just look at the words and see if you can unscramble them. This is the very start of the vocabulary for today. It's 2 messages. Good. Good. You're getting them. Yeah. Terrific. Okay. So you can unmute or write in the chat. What is the first one? Spinal. Good. The second one? Lumbar. And the third one? Vertebrae. And 4? The nerve. 5? That's a bit tougher, that one. It's the sacrum. 6. Something that happens quite quickly if you touch something. Reflex. Good. 7. Good. Yeah, the coccyx. 8.
Cervical.
Cervical. Good. 9. That's a tough one. Meninges. Good. And 10. 2 words. Gray matter. Excellent. You win $1 trillion quadrillion game show. Okay. The spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord. If you recall from the brain dissection, here is the cerebrum of the brain. What's this structure called? The smaller structure on the caudal end of the brain. Do you remember? Starts with a C as well. And the cerebellum. And the brain itself has the brain stem here, which continues with the spinal cord. The spinal cord, it's likened to an information highway. And it's kind of a good analogy because the highway has entrances and exits, and the spinal cord is the same. It's an information highway between the brain and the body. The hole in the skull, so you can imagine the skull is a hard, bony structure, but there is a hole in the skull. It's called the foramen. Let's see. The foramen magnum. And as Hillary was saying in the lab that day, if a 4-legged animal has the foramen magnum at the back of the skull, but as a bipedal animal, humans have the foramen magnum underneath the skull because the spine has to extend to the vertebrae and the upper body. So the spinal cord extends from this hole, the foramen magnum, to L1, lumbar vertebra number 1. So that's how far it extends. And the spinal cord is part of the CNS, but the spinal nerves are part of the other part of the nervous system, not the central nervous system, but the, starts with a P, not the central nervous system, but the, do you remember the name?
Peripheral.
Peripheral nervous system. Spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Good, good. Let's see. Each vertebra has spinal nerves extending to both sides of the body, a pair of spinal nerves. A pair of spinal nerves. So they extend from either side to the left side of the body and the right side of the body. So each pair or each of the pair, each nerve of the pair contains both sensory and motor information. Sensory and motor signals or information. Yeah, to and from the skin, the skeletal muscles, the glands, the smooth muscles, the blood vessels, the viscera. So what are functions? Overall, the function of the nervous system is, as you rightly said, communication. So we're going to break it down a little bit more with the spinal cord because the spinal cord works not autonomically, I won't say that, but it does work in such a way that it can respond very quickly to things of danger, like something very hot or having to kick out for some reason, which is why you can get testing for your reflexes. They're very fast. But let's say the first function may be conduction. It's a pathway. It's a pathway. So the spinal cord provides a path for the nerves to travel up and down the body. So bundles of fibers travel up and down the spinal cord. I'm just going to put SC for spinal cord. Also, for repetitive kinds of motions, the spinal cord is responsible for locomotion. So for repetitive coordinated actions of several muscles. For example, those involved in walking. There are a lot of muscles in the foot and the ankle and the leg involved in walking. And the other function, I would say, are reflexes. Reflexes. So they are involuntary. Here is the extension of the spinal cord. So it is about the size of your finger, your forefinger. So the spinal cord is 1.8 centimeters in diameter and about 45 centimeters in length. And it extends to L1, from which point the nerves simply branch. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And they arise from the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. So the cervical region is up there, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, and the sacral spinal nerves. There are two areas where the spinal cord is enlarged: the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. And the reason is that they give rise to nerves that innervate the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So the cervical gives rise to nerves innervating the upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement nerves to the lower limbs. From L2 to S5, so lumbar vertebra 2 to S5, the sacral roots, that's known as the cauda equina. Because it looks like a horse's tail. That is the nerve roots from L2 to S5. And this area innervates the pelvic region and also the lower limbs. Innervates pelvic region and lower limbs. When I say innervate, I mean that the nerves travel to that region. The motor nerves travel there, and the sensory nerve travel from that region. I think the text might use other words like it serves that region, or it supplies that region, and that means the same thing. So the cord itself has grooves dorsally and ventrally. The ventral one is called the ventral median fissure. And like the longitudinal fissure in the brain, it's very deep. The dorsal one is called the dorsal median sulcus. So like the sulci in the brain, it's not that deep. It's just a smaller groove. The spinal cord. Anatomy. So here are some terms. Conus medullaris, that's the terminal portion of the spinal cord. The filum terminale is the fibrous extension of the pia mater. So that's the innermost meninges, and it anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. Denticulate ligaments, I'll show you these in a second. Those are shelves of pia mater, and they attach the spinal cord to the vertebrae, so they anchor it to the vertebrae. The spinal nerves are the 31 pairs that we talked about. They're attached to the cord by nerve roots, paired roots, and I'll show you those. Cervical nerves are named for the inferior vertebrae, and all other nerves are named for the superior vertebrae. The cervical and lumbar enlargements are sites where nerves serving the upper and lower limbs emerge, and the cauda equina is the collection of nerve roots. So there are some terms to remember about the spinal cord. If, for example, there is a requirement for an epidermal, what's it called again? An epidural, Jenny?
That's right.
Right? Okay, yeah. Okay, and so that is to assist in childbirth, so the mother doesn't feel the pain of childbirth, essentially. So there is an epidural. Epi means above the dura mater. There is a gap there that contains blood vessels and fat, and that is the location for an epidural. And that is also where the cerebral spinal fluid can be tested for certain diseases. A lumbar tap. Anyhow, we don't need to look at the gross anatomy. Let's look at the meninges. The meninges of the vertebra and spinal cord. So here is the epidermal space, the dural sheath, or the dural mater, the arachnoid mater, and it's called that because underneath it there is a network of fibers, essentially, that create a space for cerebral spinal fluid. That's called the subarachnoid space. And here is the spinal cord itself. The denticular ligaments that anchor the spinal cord. Here is the spinal cord, or a spinal nerve extending on one side. In this case, it would be the right side. And here is one extended from the left side, so two spinal nerves. The pia mater is just a thin, I've actually covered it over here. It's a thin layer just adjacent to the spinal cord itself. And this is the bone of the vertebra. So that's looking at a gross picture. If we're looking at the spinal cord itself, here is the posterior median sulcus. You can see it's just small, and the median fissure, which is a larger gap. The spinal cord has the gray matter and white matter positioned in an opposite way to the brain. So in the brain, is the white matter deep or superficial to the gray matter? In the brain, is the white matter deep or superficial to the gray matter? Superficial. Yeah. So the gray matter is on the outside in the cerebral cortex. So that's where all the integration takes place. In the spinal cord, it's the opposite. So the white matter is on the outside or superficial to the gray matter here, which is deep. So that's the gray matter. And the gray matter is named as horns because they look like the horns of, say, a deer. There's the dorsal horn of the gray matter, the lateral horn, and the ventral horn. And they're on both sides, of course. The columns are the white matter, and they contain tracts that we'll look at, tracts of nerves that are going up and down the spinal cord. And they're known as the dorsal column, the ventral column, and the lateral column. So white matter is in columns and gray matter is in horns. Actually, there's one way you could remember that, I guess. Gray has 4 letters and horn has 4 letters. That might be a way to remember. The spinal nerve that extends from the spinal cord has 2 major roots. The dorsal root here, which is sensory, and the part of that is the dorsal root ganglion, which contains the somas or the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The other root is known as the ventral root, and that contains motor neurons. Let's look at the meninges. Singular, the singular term is a meninx. This most superficial layer is the dura. And as in the brain, it's fairly thick. It's fairly thick. It's a tough, that's collagenous. So it's collagen fibers, membrane, surrounded by the epidural space. The epidural space. That is filled with fat and blood vessels. So an epidural that is administered here blocks pain signals. In the spinal cord. The middle section of meninges is called arachnoid. And it's a layer of simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium. Beneath which is a loose mesh of fibers filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And that is the subarachnoid space. It's called arachnoid. Arachnid stands for spiders. It's the group called spiders, and the mesh kind of looks like spider webs. So that's how it got its name. The inner layer, the most deep layer, is called pia mater. It's a very delicate membrane, as you saw with the brain itself. A delicate membrane. And it adheres to the spinal cord. It continues, the pia mater continues beyond the medullary cone at the base of the spinal cord as a fibrous strand called the filium terminale. The filium terminale. So that anchors the spinal cord to the pelvic bone, and the pia mater also forms denticulate ligaments. Sorry about that. Denticulate ligaments, which anchor the cord to the vertebrae. And that prevents side-to-side movement of the cord within the spinal column. There is a congenital defect in babies that can occur, and it's called spina bifida. There's spina bifida occulta, and that involves just one or a few, so I have to admit somebody here, involves one or a few vertebrae. And generally no functional problems associated with that. The more serious form is a spina bifida cystica. And that is so serious that a sac can form outside the spinal cord altogether. Oh. Ah. That's so funny. My phone was right there and I said something and Siri thought that I was calling it and then it answered me. It scared the heck out of me. Oh, there it is again. How far away do I have to put my phone?
Sorry, we don't seem to be navigating it.
Oh boy. Okay. I don't think my phone can hear me now. I'm far enough away. Although I'm probably somehow connected to these. I really don't know how that works. I only got these to teach with. They're over the ear headphones. Okay, so here we go. Just lost everything now. There we go. We're back. Yes, spina bifida cystica, whereby a sac protrudes from the spine. And in more serious cases, that can affect bowel function and kidney function and possibly renal failure. So the vertebral arch doesn't close, covering the spinal cord. And so that is why folic acid supplement is recommended for mothers or potential mothers. It's recommended to be taken in advance of pregnancy even. It's a B vitamin. Okay. Cross-sectional anatomy. So we've looked at this already. One part we didn't mention before is called the gray commisure. That is in the center, and it connects the left and right sides of the gray matter. Gray commisure. So gray matter those are neuronal cell bodies. That is where synapses take place. And where cells integrate information. So the location of integration, and integration is the formation of synapses between different neurons. There are also some dendrites, of course, not just cell bodies. It includes dendrites and the proximal parts of axons may be present as well. White matter consists of bundles of axons. And they are called tracts. Tracts. So they carry signals up and down the spinal cord. Gray matter consists of a pair of dorsal, sometimes called posterior, horns. It's just a directional term. Ventral or anterior horns, and connected by a gray commisure. The central canal is right in the center of the spinal cord, and that is where cerebral spinal fluid flows from the brain. It's continuous with the fourth ventricle of the brain. Good. Gray matter. White matter, white column, bundles of myelinated axons, and they carry signals up and down. Called tracts. And there's ascending and descending tracts. The ascending tracts are sensory, the descending tracts are motor, and they're not exactly the same. So they're known as spinal tracts. Here in red are ascending tracts, and in green are descending tracts. Ascending means it's heading upward, descending downward, and decussation means that the fibers cross over to the other side. So, two terms to know. One is contralateral, meaning the origin and destination are on opposite sides, and ipsilateral means the origin and destination are on the same side. So if there's decussation, that means the left side of the brain gets information from the right side of the body and sends motor signals from the left side of the brain to the right side of the body. So I think I'll write that down. So first of all nerves in a given tract have a similar origin and destination and function, for that matter. Because of decussation or crossing over, the left side of the brain receives sensory information from the right side of the body. So if a stroke, for example, would happen on the right side of the brain, the left side of the body would be affected. And motor commands from left side of brain to right side of the body. And decussation occurs in different parts of the spinal cord. It can be even in the brain stem, in the medulla, for example. So there are lots of different names of tracts. The dorsal column contains the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus. We'll look at a few of them. There is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So sometimes the tracts are named for their origin and destination. In this case, the origin is the spine, spino for the spine. Cerebellar, the destination will be the cerebellum. So that is useful in remembering some of the names. There is also the ventral spinocerebellar tract, so two tracts. The anterolateral system contains the spinothalamic tract, so going from the spine to the thalamus of the brain. Descending tracts include the cortical spinal tract, so from the cortex to the spine, the lateral cortical spinal tract, the lateral reticulospinal tract from the reticulum of the brain to the spine, and the medial reticulospinal tract. The lateral tectospinal tract comes from an area of the brain called the tectum. The vestibulospinal tract comes from the vestibule, which is part of the inner ear, which controls balance. And the medial tectospinal tract from the tectum to the spine. So they do have names that indicate their origin and their destination. So let's look at the dorsal column ascending pathway. So the thing to remember about sensory signals, so the dorsal column contains sensory signals. And the sensory signals are passed along three spinal nerves. Neurons, I should say neurons. So sensory signals travel across three neurons. Three neurons. From their origin, which will be a receptor for that particular signal, like the retina of the eye or touch receptors in the skin. From receptors to the brain. They go to the thalamus actually, and they're edited there. So you don't actually become conscious of many of the signals that you're receiving. I think you would go kind of crazy if that were to happen. So your thalamus edits out many of your sensory signals so that your brain gets the important ones to which it needs to react. So there's those three neurons. There's the first order neuron. It detects the stimulus. And transmits to the spinal cord or the brain stem. So that's the first neuron to enter the spinal cord or the brain stem. It's the first order neuron. The second order continues. So there's a synapse between the first order and the second order, and the second order continues to the thalamus. The book calls it the gateway to the cortex. Where much information is edited or modified so that the brain isn't inundated with sensory information. And the third order neuron goes from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Where it is integrated, it's associated between lobes sometimes, and then a motor signal is developed. What should the response be to this sensory information? So this particular one is the dorsal column. Here's the first one, the first order neuron has come into the spinal cord, but it's not synapsing until it travels up to another vertebrae. So here it is traveling here, and synapse is here, and crosses over. So here it crosses over to the second order neuron, which travels up to the thalamus, and not until it reaches the thalamus, it synapses with the third order neuron and continues to the cerebral cortex. So that's the pathway of the first, second, and third order neurons. So each of these tracts contain neurons that have particular sensory information. So you have so many different receptors in your skin. For example, you have receptors for light touch, for deep pressure touch, for hot, for cold, different ones for tickle, different ones for itch. So you have many different receptors in the skin, and they travel up different tracts. So often you can assess spinal cord injury by figuring out what function is affected in the body. Like, are you not feeling deep touch? Are you not feeling light touch, tickle or itch? Or can you not determine if something is hot or cold, for example? So the dorsal column generally the ascending pathway contains, I think the textbook uses the word fibers quite a lot. I interchange that with neurons and sometimes axons. But the entire neuron really carries the signal and then synapses with the soma and the dendrites. But I guess technically it's only the axons that are in the pathway itself. Yeah, okay, so we won't use neurons as meaning fibers. We'll just say fibers are axons because we are talking about white matter and the pathways. So these fibers carry signals for very particular senses. Things like, for example, visceral pain. So pain in the organs, the kidneys, the liver, the stomach. Vibration. Proprioception. You may not have heard of the term proprioception, but proprioception is the sense of where your muscles are in space, where your muscles are in space. So it is the non-visual sense of the positions and movement of the body. Decussation or crossing over occurs in the medulla. And it's important when assessing things like spinal cord injury where decussation occurs. So you can tell by prodding and poking where there may be numbness, for example. Another pathway is known as the spinal thalamic pathway. And the spinal thalamic pathway contains signals for pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. And you can vaguely identify where that precise feeling is coming from. So the spinal thalamic pathway. So you're probably wondering up to now, what is it you need to remember from all of this? Well, you need to remember that sensory signals, for example, are ascending, that there are 3 neurons in the pathway, and that the first order neuron will sometimes decussate. Should I write that down? I'll write that down. Hang on, add. So remember, the ascending pathways are sensory. There are 3 neurons in the pathway. They may let's see, that's how to put this. They will synapse in the spinal cord, or I think usually it is the medulla, which is part of this brain stem. And either decussate or not. Let's see, they are responsible for sensations, and different tracts are responsible for different sensations. So depending on the tract. So to remember which tract is responsible for which sensation could be a little bit too much, but do remember that different tracts are responsible for different kinds of sensations. So there are sensations such as pain, pressure, proprioception, what else? Light touch, tickle, itch. What were some of the ones from the previous one? Visceral pain, vibration, temperature. I think that would be how to do it. olfactory. So the olfactory bulb, which is in the brain, I don't know that pathway exactly, but I don't believe it does go through the thalamus. And I don't think the cranial nerves, do they go through the thalamus? I'll have to check on that, if the cranial nerves go through the thalamus. I'm not sure. Some may and some may not. That's a good thing to look into. Another pathway is called the spinocerebellar that sends proprioceptive signals from the limbs and trunk to the cerebellum. They ascend in the lateral column. Right. That is what I wanted to say about tracts for now. Ascending tracts. Let's move on to descending tracts, and then we'll have a break. Descending tracts. Are motor tracts. The difference is it is a 2-neuron pathway. So the upper motor neuron begins in the cerebral cortex. In the motor cortex. Or the brain stem. And it terminates in the spinal cord or brain stem. Good. The lower motor neuron continues the rest of the way. To a muscle, gland, or other target organ. Yeah, so for the corticospinal tract, decussation does happen in the medulla, I believe. Yeah, decussation happens in the medulla. Other tracts that are descending are known as the tectospinal tract. They're responsible for reflex movements of the head. Reticulospinal tracts that control limb movements and help to maintain posture and balance. And the vestibulospinal tract, which is instrumental in posture as well, in response to inner ear signals. So the inner ear is structured in such a way as to hold fluid and membranes and hairs, and moving the head will change the fluid in that chamber and send a signal about where your head is, essentially. Okay, so let's stop there. Thank you for watching.